June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexico, Texas. The pencil quivered in Una Fitzia Vera Burkhart's hand as he wrote in his secret diary words that would lead to solitary confinement if his officers discovered them. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation, he thought, could possess such wealth while fighting a war on two fronts. Through the window of the train, he saw something that defied everything Nazi propaganda had taught him. Every street corner, every shop window, and every farmhouse was glowing with electric lights. An endless array of electric lights stretched across the Texas plains, even at 10 at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the country into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, rural electrification had reached barely 20% of German farms. Yet, in what Nazi propaganda had painted as a decaying America, electricity flowed freely like water. As the 1,850 veterans of Erwin RML's Africa Corps stepped off the train, it was not in cattle cars or freight wagons, but in cushioned Pullman coaches, complete with dining services and sleeping berths. The entire town of Mexico had gathered to witness their arrival. What they didn't know was that this moment would begin the dismantling of Nazi ideology. The true power of the Allies wasn't just in their military victories, but in the overwhelming display of American industrial might. The math behind the Allied victory was being written not on battlefields, but in factory production statistics that would soon shatter everything these soldiers believed about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. It all began with the surrender of General Jürgen von Arnim and up to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers on May 13, 1943. In Tunisia, the Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert fighters, who had once pushed the British back to Egypt and earned Montgomery's grudging respect, were now prisoners. Among them was Hetman Friedrich Radka, a decorated veteran who had fought in France and North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later, would provide historians with one of the most profound accounts of the psychological effects American captivity had on German soldiers. Their journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Oran, Algeria, as Radka and 30,000 other prisoners waited for transport ships. American efficiency was already beginning to challenge their assumptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners each day with an organizational precision the Wehrmacht could never match. Their identity cards were photographed and filed, medical exams given, inoculations administered, and Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German. But the real shock came when they were fed. Oberreiter Hans Immer, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote home 8 months later, "The Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration." Even the Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were symbols of American industrial strength, built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. They were a testament to American capacity. By July 1943, these ships were carrying up to 30,000 prisoners a month. The 2-week Atlantic crossing would prove to be another phase in the psychological destruction of Nazi beliefs. As they crossed the ocean, German soldiers discovered that the ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than their entire company had received in 6 months. They threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, and gallons of milk that had gone sour. Kurt Zimmermann wrote in a letter to his family, "They did this casually, without thought, because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was endless." These ships were a floating testament to American industry. The Germans learned that each vessel was one of 2,710 Liberty ships, each with 250,000 parts assembled from factories spread across 32 states. The engines were produced in separate factories, each building 900 horsepower cylinders. The workers, They realized were in a position of unimaginable power. As the ships approached the American coast, Lt. Colonel Wilhelm von Street-O'Byrne, a seasoned officer from a long line of Prussian warriors, saw the radar on the ship's bridge. It was standard equipment. He thought, only we, and perhaps the British, had such technology. At that moment, he suspected Germany had already lost the war. By August 2, 1943, as they arrived at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness were obliterated. Norfolk sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for miles. On that single day, the port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg could manage in a week. We passed through dozens of cities that first night, wrote Oberreiter Mer. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. In Germany, private car ownership was rare, only accessible to the wealthy and party elite. Yet, in America, even dock workers drove their own cars, but nothing prepared them for the trains. Not boxcars, not the cramped, uncomfortable wagons that had carried German soldiers across Europe. Instead, they boarded Pullman cars, with padded seats that converted into sleeping berths. Some cars even had air conditioning. The psychological transformation continued as they passed through small American towns, all brightly illuminated. The prisoners, in disbelief, watched as factories ran night shifts, and homes lit up from within. In Germany, even major cities were dark by night. Here, the American dream of prosperity was alive, tangible, and it was a sharp contrast to the nightmare the soldiers had been led to believe existed in this so-called decadent nation. They had been prisoners, but they boarded the trains like tourists. With each passing mile, the reality of America shattered everything they had been taught to believe. The war was no longer just a fight on the battlefield. It was an ideological battle, and America was winning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his command room, staring at the map of the Pacific before him. The radio transmissions echoed in the background, the voices of military leaders, both in Tokyo and across the vast ocean, exchanging words that spoke of ambition and conflict. Yamamoto's strategic concerns weighed heavily on his mind, especially as Japan's military leadership argued over the course of action. He, the architect behind the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, had a different vision, one that ran contrary to the blind rush into an all-out, unlimited war. For Yamamoto, the path to victory was not through constant expansion, but through a calculated and limited approach. He had long understood the vast industrial might of the United States. It was a power that could not be matched by Japan's resources in the long run. While others in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy clamored for more conquest in the Pacific, more targets to strike, more territory to claim, Yamamoto worried about the future. His deep fear was that Japan was overreaching, that the nation was on the brink of igniting a war it could not sustain. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had been a stunning success, but Yamamoto knew it was only a temporary measure. The real battle was ahead: how to prevent the United States from fully mobilizing its immense power and bringing its industrial might to bear. His concerns about a protracted war in the Pacific echoed through his quiet moments of reflection. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant," he had said, his words carrying an ominous weight. That giant, the United States, had been temporarily stunned, but was only beginning to rise. The planning for Midway was the point where Yamamoto's anxieties were tested. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, Japan had swept through the Pacific, capturing vast stretches of territory, but the victories, while impressive, had also stretched Japan's resources thin. Now, the goal was to secure Midway Island, a strategic point that could potentially give Japan dominance over the Pacific. However, Yamamoto, ever the realist, worried about the cost of such an operation. He had been forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. Japan could not afford to waste its resources on a protracted war of attrition. Internal divisions among Japan's military leaders only compounded the challenge. There was no unified vision. Some commanders advocated for further expansion, taking the Soviet Union's Far East, invading Australia, and even pushing into the Indian Ocean. Yamamoto found himself caught in a delicate web of politics, where his warnings against overextending Japan's forces were often drowned out by the call for more aggressive campaigns. The debates were intense and passionate, but Yamamoto remained steadfast in his belief that Japan's survival depended on seizing key strategic victories without jeopardizing its long-term position. In early 1942, the decision to strike at Midway Island would either solidify Japan's dominance in the Pacific or led to its downfall. Yamamoto personally led the attack, knowing that the outcome would shape Japan's future in the war. The resulting battle, the Battle of Midway, became a pivotal turning point. Despite his meticulous planning, Japan's forces were outsmarted by the American fleet, and the devastating loss at Midway was a bitter blow to Yamamoto's vision. From that moment, the internal conflict within Japan's military leadership only grew more intense. The question of what target to pursue next loomed large. Should Japan focus on consolidating its gains, or should it press further into the Pacific, hoping to weaken the United States with further strikes? As debates raged, Yamamoto's warnings were becoming ever more prophetic. He understood the stakes of this war more than most. An unlimited war could only lead to one conclusion: defeat for Japan. As the war dragged on, Yamamoto's fears grew. He had known all along that Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States. The failure to understand the power of American industry had been the greatest misstep of all. With each new defeat, it became more evident. Japan was on the losing side of history. In the end, Yamamoto's vision of a limited war, focused on key strategic points, was drowned out by the very forces he had warned against. As the United States industrial power surged forward, Japan's efforts to maintain its empire crumbled. The path Yamamoto had feared was becoming all too real. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his office, the weight of Japan's future pressing down on him. As the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, he had once believed that Japan could defeat the United States with a swift, decisive strike. But as the war dragged on, his doubts deepened. Yamamoto had always been a realist, and the more he considered the vast resources of the United States, the more he feared that Japan was heading toward a war of attrition it could not win. Pearl Harbor was intended to be a devastating blow, one that would cripple the U.S. Navy and buy Japan time to consolidate its gains in the Pacific. However, Yamamoto knew that this victory was only temporary. Japan's true vulnerability lay in its lack of industrial capacity, a weakness that the United States could easily overcome with its sprawling factories and limitless resources. Yamamoto feared that Japan was overextending itself, trying to conquer too much territory without the means to sustain its empire. By 1942, Yamamoto's concerns were only growing. His strategic focus had shifted from expanding the Japanese empire to preserving Japan's military advantage. The Battle of Midway, a crucial turning point in the Pacific War, was fast approaching, and Yamamoto was faced with the difficult task of planning an attack that could secure Japan's dominance in the Pacific while avoiding unnecessary risks. The success of the Midway operation was essential for Japan's survival, but Yamamoto feared it could also be a gamble that might ultimately lead to Japan's downfall. Within the Japanese military, there were factions pushing for further expansion. Some commanders advocated for striking the Soviet Union's eastern territories, while others urged an offensive toward Australia or into the Indian Ocean. The military leadership was divided. While some sought to extend Japan's reach, Yamamoto's vision was more cautious. He believed Japan could not afford to wage an unlimited war. Instead, he argued for a strategy that focused on key strategically vital islands, allowing Japan to build a defensive perimeter while preserving its resources. The planning for Midway, however, revealed the internal strife within Japan's military. Many leaders were eager to secure a decisive victory, pushing for an all-out assault on the island. Yamamoto, while agreeing to the operation, privately feared the consequences of overextending Japanese forces. The Battle of Midway would not only be a test of military strength, but also of Japan's capacity to endure a prolonged conflict. Yamamoto's strategic concerns about the limitations of Japan's war-making abilities had led him to oppose the idea of unlimited war. When the battle unfolded, the devastating loss for Japan proved Yamamoto's fears correct. The United States, through a combination of intelligence and superior tactics, outmaneuvered the Japanese fleet. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots was a blow from which Japan would never fully recover. Yamamoto, once the hero of the Pearl Harbor attack, now found himself questioning his own role in leading Japan toward an unwinnable war. The internal debates continued as the war expanded. Some military leaders called for further strikes on Australia and the Soviet Union, seeing them as opportunities to strike at perceived weak points. But Yamamoto's warnings grew louder. He knew that Japan had already overcommitted, and the United States was steadily building its strength. Each victory the U.S. achieved brought them closer to overwhelming Japan's defenses. Yamamoto's greatest fear was unfolding. A war that Japan could never win. A war of attrition that would leave Japan broken and exhausted. As the year 1943 approached, Yamamoto's concerns about the future of Japan remained. He had always believed that Japan's best chance at survival lay in limiting its territorial ambitions, focusing on defensive strategies, and avoiding a prolonged conflict with the industrial powerhouse of the United States. But as Japan continued to push forward, it became clear that the battle for the Pacific was shifting in favor of the Allies. Yamamoto's vision of a limited war was drowned out by the voices of those calling for total victory at any cost. And the consequences of that choice would shape the fate of Japan in the years to come. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat quietly in his office, his mind consumed with the weight of Japan's growing military commitments. As the architect of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had believed the conflict with the United States could be won with a swift, decisive strike. However, the reality of war was beginning to sink in, and he knew that Japan could not sustain an endless conflict against such an industrial powerhouse. Despite the initial successes, he increasingly found himself in opposition to the Japanese military's push for unlimited war. Yamamoto had long feared that Japan's military leaders were overestimating their ability to win. The United States, with its vast resources and industrial capabilities, was capable of mobilizing at a scale Japan could never match. For Yamamoto, the war was no longer about expansion or overwhelming force, it was about survival. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but it was a strategic gamble. The war against the United States, he feared, was a fight Japan could not win in the long term. By mid-1942, Yamamoto's concerns became even clearer. The military's leaders were pushing for further expansion into the Pacific, targeting places like the Soviet Union's eastern territories, Australia, and the Indian Ocean. These were aggressive moves, yet Yamamoto saw them as reckless. Japan lacked the resources to sustain such a vast empire. Yamamoto believed that Japan's best hope lay in seizing strategic points, solidifying its defenses, and avoiding an extended conflict. However, his warnings were often drowned out by the fervor of those calling for further territorial gains. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a crucial moment in Yamamoto's campaign. The battle was a direct result of Japan's expansionist goals, but Yamamoto had misgivings about overextending Japan's forces. While he agreed to the operation, He privately feared that a large-scale assault on Midway would expose Japan to disastrous consequences. When the battle unfolded, it proved his fears to be correct. The United States, with its superior intelligence and military tactics, decisively defeated Japan, sinking 4 of its aircraft carriers and crippling the Japanese fleet. In the aftermath of Midway, Japan's military leaders found themselves in a quandary. Some advocated for further attacks, especially against Australia or the Soviet Union. But Yamamoto remained steadfast in his belief that Japan could not afford to continue a war on so many fronts. His caution was rooted in his knowledge of the American industrial machine, which, unlike Japan's, could produce war material at an unprecedented scale. As the war progressed, Yamamoto's warnings went largely unheeded, and Japan continued its push into the Pacific. However, each battle, each campaign, showed that Japan was losing ground. Yamamoto's opposition to the war's unlimited nature became more apparent, but his voice was often sidelined by those pushing for total victory. In the end, his prediction came true. Japan had overextended itself, and the United States' industrial capacity would prove to be its undoing. The internal conflict within Japan's military leadership grew as the war dragged on. Debates about future targets such as the Soviet Union, Australia, and the Indian Ocean intensified. But Yamamoto's concerns about the limits of Japan's power were prophetic. The outcome of the war would not be decided by the strength of the Japanese military, but by the strength of the United States industry, which continued to outpace Japan's ability to compete. Yamamoto's warnings had fallen on deaf ears, and by the time Japan realized the extent of its overreach, it was already too late. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood at the crossroads of Japan's fate, torn between the strategic brilliance of his initial plans and the overwhelming reality of the conflict at hand. As the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had hoped to deliver a crushing blow to the United States, hoping to cripple its Pacific fleet and buy Japan time to secure its territorial expansion. Yet, as the war unfolded, Yamamoto's concerns about the long-term viability of such a war began to mount. The United States, with its immense industrial capacity, proved to be an opponent Japan could not outlast. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but Yamamoto understood the strategic risk it posed. His worst fears were becoming reality. The United States was mobilizing on a scale Japan could never match, while some of Japan's military leaders pushed for further conquests, seeking to strike at the Soviet Union, Australia, or the Indian Ocean. Yamamoto opposed these plans. He believed that Japan's survival depended on avoiding a prolonged war of attrition, one it could not sustain against the American industrial colossus. Yamamoto's warning fell on deaf ears as the military leadership grew increasingly desperate to press on. The planning for the Battle of Midway, the critical engagement in June 1942, underscored the growing divide within Japan's military command. While Yamamoto reluctantly supported the operation, he feared the strategic overreach it represented. Midway was a pivotal battle that could secure Japan's control over the Pacific, but Yamamoto knew it could also expose Japan's weaknesses. When the battle unfolded, Yamamoto's worst fears were realized. The United States, leveraging its superior intelligence and tactical flexibility, delivered a crushing blow to Japan, losing only 1 aircraft carrier while sinking 4 of Japan's. The defeat at Midway sent shockwaves through Japan's military command. Despite this, some factions within the military still argued for further aggression. Their sights turned to new targets: the Soviet Union, Australia, and the Indian Ocean. However, Yamamoto remained resolute in his belief that Japan could not afford to stretch itself any further. His opposition to unlimited war was rooted in a stark understanding of the balance of power. He knew that Japan's resources were finite, while the United States had the capacity to mobilize and produce on a scale Japan could never match. The growing internal conflict within Japan's leadership reached a boiling point as the war stretched on. Some leaders clung to the belief that Japan could win through sheer force and determination, while Yamamoto recognized the inevitable. A war of attrition with the United States would ultimately lead to Japan's destruction. The inability to recognize the limitations of their strategy would cost Japan dearly. As the war continued, Yamamoto's role as a strategist became ever more fraught. His fears of an unlimited war were becoming all too real, and the military leadership's push for further expansion only exacerbated the situation. Japan's resources were stretched thin, and the United States industrial might only grew stronger. Yamamoto's warnings of overreach and the dangers of a prolonged conflict went largely unheeded. By the time Japan's military realized the full scope of its miscalculation, it was already too late. Yamamoto's tragic insight into the limits of Japan's power was drowned out by the fervor of those still bent on pursuing a total victory. As the war dragged on, it became clear that Japan's inability to scale back its ambitions would ultimately lead to its downfall. In the face of overwhelming American industrial strength, Japan's dream of victory was shattered.